Millionaire loses everything when he discovers the truth about his family's dark past, but alongside a mysterious woman from the landfill, he is about to reveal a secret that could change their fate forever. What he never expected was that this revelation would make him question everything he believed about love, power, and sacrifice. The scent of damp earth and decay filled the air as Julian stood on the edge of the city's largest landfill. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, broken only by the occasional rising pile of discarded trash and debris. He had no real reason to be here, other than a vague sense of curiosity that had drawn him away from the glass towers and marble floors he was so accustomed to. Something about this place felt different, a stark contrast to the life he'd always known, but it was exactly what he needed. A break from the endless cycle of wealth, superficial connections, and empty conversations. Julian adjusted the collar of his coat, feeling out of place but oddly intrigued. He had heard rumors of people who lived here, those who had nothing and found ways to survive off what others discarded. But amidst the rubbish and the overwhelming scent, there was a quiet hum of life. As he wandered deeper into the landfill, he noticed movement in the distance, a figure, standing among the trash as if it were natural, as if it were home. Curiosity piqued, Julian moved closer, and as he did, the figure became clearer. A woman, her posture straight and regal despite her surroundings, bent down to sift through a pile of old books and broken trinkets. There was something undeniably captivating about her, something that didn't fit this place. She wore a simple, worn-out dress, but there was an air of grace about her, as if she were more than what her surroundings suggested. "Hello," Julian called out, unsure of what to expect. The woman straightened up, turning to face him. Her dark hair framed her sharp, intelligent eyes, and her expression was calm, almost amused. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. "What brings you to a place like this?" Julian hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "I could ask you the same question," he replied, trying to keep his tone light, though her presence made him feel uncharacteristically nervous. "I live here," she said simply, a faint smile touching her lips. "But you're different." Her gaze seemed to assess him with a depth that made him feel as if she could see through the polished exterior he usually wore. "I'm Elena," she added, extending a hand as if they were meeting in a ballroom instead of a landfill. Julian took her hand, surprised by her confidence. "Julian," he introduced himself. "What do you mean by different?" Elena let go of his hand and gestured around her. "People like you don't come here unless they're lost." "Are you lost, Julian?" The question lingered in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Julian didn't answer right away. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, he didn't know what had brought him here. But as he looked into Elena's eyes, he felt that perhaps, just perhaps, he had found a reason to stay. The following day, Julian found himself unable to shake the encounter with Elena from his mind. Her eyes, her words, the strange mix of elegance and resilience that surrounded her, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He spent the day drifting through his usual routine, meetings with investors, polite conversations over lunch, yet nothing seemed to hold his attention. Every thought was drawn back to the landfill, to Elena. That evening, as the sun began to set, Julian's car was already heading in the direction of the landfill once again. He didn't know why he was returning, perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper. All he knew was that something about Elena had hooked him, made him question things he had never even considered before. As he approached the landfill, the smell of decay returned, stronger this time with the warmth of the setting sun. Yet, it didn't deter him. Julian parked his car and walked the now familiar path toward where he had first seen Elena. He spotted her almost immediately. She was sitting on a makeshift bench constructed from old crates, flipping through what appeared to be a torn, weathered book. Her focus was intense, her fingers tracing the pages as if she were holding something priceless. "Back so soon?" she asked, without looking up, as if she had known he would return. Julian hesitated for a moment, then approached. "I suppose so. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said yesterday." Elena closed the book and looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "And what exactly did I say that made you come back?" Julian sat down beside her, ignoring the discomfort of the rough crate beneath him. "You said I was lost?" Elena's lips curved into a small smile. "And are you?" He didn't answer right away. It was a question that felt too heavy, too complicated to give a simple reply. Instead, he focused on her book. "What are you reading?" She held it out for him to see. "It's an old book of fairy tales, stories about kingdoms and lost princesses." Julian raised an eyebrow, surprised by the choice. "Fairy tales? I didn't expect that." Elena shrugged, her gaze turning distant. "There's truth in stories like these. More than people think." "And what truth are you looking for?" Julian asked, genuinely curious now. The more she spoke, the more he felt drawn into her world, as if each word was unraveling a mystery he was desperate to solve. Elena paused for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm not looking for anything," she said softly. "I know who I am. The truth is already with me." Something in her tone made Julian's heart skip. He could feel that there was more to her words, something deeper that she wasn't saying. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then tell me." She looked at him, her eyes sharp and piercing. "I'm Elena, the last of a royal bloodline. My family was once rulers, but our dynasty was destroyed by greed and betrayal. I ended up here, forgotten by the world." Julian blinked, unsure of how to react. It was the last thing he had expected her to say. Royal bloodline? A lost dynasty? The rational part of him wanted to laugh, dismiss it as a story from her book of fairy tales, but there was something about the way she said it that stopped him. "You don't believe me," Elena said quietly, her eyes searching his face for signs of disbelief. Julian hesitated. "I don't know what to believe." Elena stood up, her expression calm but firm. "That's fine. You're not the first to doubt me, and you won't be the last. But the truth remains, whether people believe it or not." Julian found himself standing as well, his curiosity only growing stronger. "If what you're saying is true, why are you here? Why would a princess live in a place like this?" Elena turned away, her gaze sweeping across the sea of trash and forgotten objects. "Because this is where the world put me. And this is where I'll stay, until the time is right." Her words hung in the air, filled with a quiet certainty that left Julian speechless. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. And yet, he knew he would be back again. There was no escaping the pull of Elena's mystery. The days that followed became a blur for Julian. His usual life of luxury and privilege continued as expected, meetings with wealthy clients, discussions about investments, and endless parties. But his thoughts were always elsewhere, always with Elena. The curiosity she had ignited within him was like a flame that refused to die down. The idea of a lost princess living in the city's forgotten wasteland felt too surreal, yet there was a part of him that couldn't let go of the possibility that it might be true. He returned to the landfill several times over the next week, each visit bringing new conversations with Elena. She spoke with the same certainty, weaving stories of her family's past, their downfall, and how she ended up in the landfill. Julian listened, enraptured by the strange blend of reality and fantasy that seemed to surround her. She had a way of speaking that made even the most unbelievable things seem plausible. And despite his initial skepticism, he found himself wanting to believe her. However, Julian's frequent absences from his usual social life did not go unnoticed. His father, Gerald, was quick to catch on that something was distracting him. Over breakfast one morning, Gerald folded his newspaper and looked at his son with a disapproving frown. "You've been disappearing quite a lot lately," Gerald said, his voice edged with suspicion. "Where exactly have you been going?" Julian kept his gaze on his coffee cup, stirring it absent-mindedly. "Just exploring the city. Getting away from all the noise." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Exploring? You mean abandoning your responsibilities? What is it you're so preoccupied with? Another woman, I assume?" Julian tensed at the question. His father was never one to mince words, but there was an intensity behind his voice that made Julian uncomfortable. "It's not like that, Dad." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Then what is it? You've been distracted, and it's affecting your work. Whatever this is, it needs to stop. I won't have you tarnishing our family's name." The conversation weighed heavily on Julian. He had always known his father to be controlling, but the idea that something so personal, his growing connection with Elena, was now under scrutiny felt suffocating. He didn't want to explain her to his father, didn't want to try and justify why he kept going back to the landfill. It was something private, something he didn't fully understand himself. Later that evening, Julian found himself at the landfill once more. Elena was waiting for him, as if she had expected his return. They sat together, the sounds of the city far in the distance as the landfill seemed to exist in its own separate reality. Julian found comfort in the strange tranquility of it all. "You seem troubled," Elena observed, her voice soft in the twilight. "What's weighing on you?" Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's my father. He's starting to notice that I've been coming here. He thinks it's a distraction." Elena looked at him thoughtfully. "And what do you think? Do you see this as a distraction?" Julian paused, considering her words carefully. "No. I don't know what this is yet, but it doesn't feel like a distraction. It feels important." Elena smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the sunset. "It is important, Julian. And not just for me. You're searching for something, just like I am. Maybe we're both lost in our own way." For the first time, Julian felt a sense of clarity. His connection with Elena wasn't just about the mystery surrounding her past. It was about something deeper, something that had been missing from his life for years. He was tired of the superficiality, of the endless cycle of wealth and power that defined his existence. Here, with Elena, everything felt more real. But reality was catching up to him fast. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized that his father wouldn't let this go easily. Gerald was a man who valued control above all else, and the idea of his son spending time with someone like Elena, someone who didn't fit into the pristine world of wealth and influence, would be unacceptable to him. And then there was the question that Julian couldn't shake: what if his father was right? What if this was all just a fantasy, a beautiful but impossible dream? Could he afford to risk everything, his reputation, his future, on the chance that Elena's story was true? As the night settled in around them, Julian turned to Elena, his voice quiet but firm. What happens if people don't believe your story? What if no one ever recognizes you as who you say you are? Elena's expression didn't falter. The truth doesn't need recognition to exist. It's there, whether people see it or not. And in time, it will reveal itself. You'll see. Julian stared at her, feeling a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. For now, he could only hope that she was right. Julian couldn't let it go. After his conversation with Elena, the weight of her words lingered in his mind. There was something about her quiet confidence, her unwavering belief in her story, that pushed him to dig deeper. He didn't fully understand why, but he needed to know more. If Elena's claim about her royal lineage was true, it would change everything. But how could someone like her, someone living in a landfill, be connected to a dynasty he had never heard of? One afternoon, Julian sat in his study, scrolling through historical archives, old family documents, and public records. He didn't expect to find much, but as he dug deeper, something caught his eye. A name. An estate that had once belonged to a powerful family, now in ruins. The estate had been tied to a line of nobility that had mysteriously disappeared decades ago, their wealth and power quietly absorbed by new players in the business world. Julian's heart raced as he read through the documents. It was possible. The timelines, the names, they all matched up with the details Elena had shared. The most unsettling discovery, however, came when he traced his own family's history back to the same period. There, in black and white, was the name of his grandfather, listed as one of the beneficiaries of the wealth that had been seized from the very dynasty Elena claimed to be part of. Julian's pulse quickened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Could it be that his own family had played a role in Elena's downfall? The thought sent a chill through him. That evening, Julian returned to the landfill with the information he had uncovered. Elena was sitting in her usual spot, watching the sun set behind the hills of trash, her face calm and serene. Julian approached her, the weight of the revelation heavy on his shoulders. "I found something," he said, his voice low and tense. Elena looked at him with mild curiosity, but there was no surprise in her eyes. "What did you find?" Julian sat down beside her, pulling out a few of the printed documents from his bag. "Your family. The estate you mentioned. It's real. There was a dynasty, just like you said." And, his voice faltered as he handed her the papers. "My family was involved in its fall." Elena took the papers from his hands and glanced over them, her expression unreadable. She was quiet for a long time before speaking. "I know." Julian blinked, taken aback by her calm response. You knew." Elena nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I've known for a long time. That's why I'm here. I'm waiting for the truth to be acknowledged. But the world moves on, and people forget. Your family took everything, and my family was left with nothing. And now here we are, sitting on the remnants of what's left." Julian's throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena turned to face him, her eyes soft but steady. "Because it wasn't my place to tell you. You had to find it on your own." Julian felt a knot of guilt twist in his chest. His family had prospered from the ruin of Elena's ancestors, and now, without even knowing it, he had stumbled into her world, connected by a history he had never learned. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words feeling hollow even as he said them. "I know you didn't," Elena said gently. "And that's why I don't blame you. This isn't your fault, Julian. But now that you know, what will you do?" The question hung in the air, filled with an unspoken challenge. Julian stared at her, his mind racing. What would he do? The truth he had uncovered had the power to destroy everything he knew, but could he turn away from it now that it was staring him in the face? The discovery weighed heavily on Julian's mind. He had returned from the landfill that night with the truth hanging over him like a dark cloud. The knowledge that his family had profited from the destruction of Elena's dynasty left him conflicted. The guilt was something he could no longer ignore, but the question remained, what could he possibly do to fix it? Was it even his place to make things right after all this time? Days passed, and Julian found it increasingly difficult to balance his growing connection with Elena and the life he was supposed to maintain. The pressure from his father only grew stronger, with Gerald demanding answers for his frequent disappearances. Julian had always known his father was a man of control, but now that control felt like a noose tightening around his neck. It all came to a head one morning when Gerald confronted Julian in his office. The room was immaculate, the leather-bound books on the shelves untouched, the desk cluttered only with business papers. Julian sat behind it, staring blankly at the stack of documents in front of him, his mind far from the world of business deals and investments. "Enough is enough, Julian," Gerald said sharply, storming into the room. "I've given you time, but this nonsense has to stop. Your mother and I have heard rumors. You've been spending time with someone who lives in a landfill." His voice dripped with disdain, as if the very idea was beneath him. Julian looked up, feeling the weight of his father's judgment. "Her name is Elena." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "I don't care what her name is. I care about this family, our legacy, and the future you're supposed to be building. What on earth are you thinking, associating with someone like that?" Julian stood, frustration boiling over. "It's not about who she is, it's about what's right. Our family, your father, took everything from her. We destroyed her family's legacy." Gerald's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't seen the same records you've been poring over? It was business, Julian. That's how the world works. The strong survive, and the weak fall. You should be grateful you're on the right side of history." Julian recoiled at his father's words, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. Grateful? For what? For a fortune built on the ruins of someone else's life? That's what you think our legacy should be? Gerald's eyes flashed with anger, but his voice remained cold and controlled. "I think you're being naive. You can't change the past, Julian, and no amount of playing hero will undo what's already been done. This is your life, your responsibility. You need to forget about this woman and focus on what matters." But Julian couldn't forget. He couldn't simply walk away from the truth now that it had been laid bare in front of him. His connection to Elena had become more than just curiosity, it was a growing sense of responsibility, a need to make things right, even if he wasn't entirely sure how. "I won't abandon her," Julian said firmly, standing his ground. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to help her." Gerald stared at him in disbelief, then shook his head in disgust. "You're a fool if you think this will lead to anything good. You'll lose everything. Your position in this family, your inheritance, everything." Julian met his father's gaze, feeling the weight of his words sink in. He knew what was at stake, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the money, the power, or the legacy his father had built. All that mattered now was doing what was right, and that meant standing by Elena, no matter the cost. "I'll make my own way," Julian said, his voice calm but resolute. "With or without the family's fortune." Gerald's expression darkened, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't expect to come crawling back when this blows up in your face." Julian didn't respond. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. That night, he returned to the landfill, where Elena was waiting, as she always seemed to be. The cool evening air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rusted metal, but Julian found solace in the silence of the place. It felt like a world apart from everything he had known, a refuge from the pressures of his family and the expectations that weighed so heavily on his shoulders. Elena looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "I take it your father didn't take the news well." Julian sat down beside her, exhaling deeply. "He threatened to cut me off." Elena didn't seem surprised. "And you're okay with that?" Julian met her gaze, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. "I am." The following morning, Julian awoke with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The decision to stand by Elena, no matter the cost, had freed him in a way he never expected. For too long, he had been tethered to a life that wasn't his, a life dictated by wealth and expectations. Now, he was stepping into something uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like it had purpose. He spent the early hours going through old family records again, trying to trace the connection between his grandfather and Elena's lineage. There was so much still left unsaid, so many pieces of the puzzle missing, but one thing was clear: his family had taken something that didn't belong to them. His research led him deeper into the archives, to long-forgotten documents about land deals, business mergers, and hostile takeovers that had shaped his family's empire. And in the middle of it all was Elena's family name. Julian sat back, staring at the documents in front of him. The weight of the truth was undeniable. His grandfather had orchestrated a plan that destroyed Elena's family, taking their wealth and leaving them with nothing. The estate, the titles, the fortune, all of it had been absorbed into his family's empire, buried under decades of business success. That evening, Julian went to the landfill with the documents in hand. The sun was setting as he approached Elena's makeshift home, the sky streaked with hues of orange and pink. Elena was there, as always, her expression calm and composed as she watched him approach. "I found more," Julian said, his voice heavy with the weight of the discovery. Elena stood, her gaze steady as she waited for him to speak. Julian handed her the papers, his voice quiet. "It's all here. My grandfather orchestrated the takeover of your family's estate. He took everything, your lands, your fortune, your title. He made sure no one would ever remember who you were." Elena took the papers from his hands, scanning them briefly before setting them aside. Her expression didn't change, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that Julian hadn't seen before. "I knew most of this," she said softly. "I've spent years piecing it together. But it's different, hearing it from you. Seeing the proof." Julian's heart ached at the sight of her pain. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this until now." Elena turned to face him fully, her gaze unwavering. "It's not your fault, Julian. You weren't the one who did this. But now that you know the truth, the question is, what will you do about it?" Julian met her eyes, feeling the weight of her words. The truth had been unearthed, but it was only the beginning. What came next would define not just his future, but theirs together. "I want to help you," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I don't know how yet, but I want to make things right. Your family deserves to be remembered, and you deserve to reclaim what was taken from you." Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Do you really believe that, Julian? That you can make this right?" Julian hesitated, then nodded. "I have to try." Elena's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was a hint of sadness in it. The world doesn't always allow for things to be made right. Sometimes, all we can do is move forward. Julian reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then we'll move forward together." Elena looked down at their joined hands, her smile growing a little stronger. "Together," she echoed. As the night settled in around them, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, but with Elena by his side, he knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The grand ballroom was filled with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of champagne glasses. The elite of the city had gathered, dressed in their finest, for one of the most prestigious events of the year, a charity gala hosted by none other than Julian's family. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting golden light on the polished marble floors, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and wealth. Julian stood near the entrance, his mind far from the glamour around him. He had avoided these events for weeks now, his time spent with Elena at the landfill, but tonight, he knew he had to be here. Tonight, everything would change. Across the room, Gerald stood at the center of a small group of wealthy businessmen, his smile as polished as ever. He commanded the room effortlessly, exuding the kind of power and influence that had defined Julian's life for as long as he could remember. But tonight, that power felt like a cage Julian was about to break free from. Elena stood by his side, her presence incongruous with the lavish setting. She was dressed simply, in a modest black dress that she had found and restored herself, a stark contrast to the glittering gowns of the women around her. And yet, even in her simplicity, there was an undeniable elegance to her, a quiet dignity that drew more than a few curious glances. "This is it," Julian whispered, glancing at her. "Are you ready?" Elena nodded, her expression calm. "I've been ready for a long time." Julian took a deep breath and began to move toward the center of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent days thinking about how to do this, how to confront his father in a way that would make an impact. Now, there was no turning back. The murmur of conversation died down as Julian stepped onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom, the spotlight suddenly on him. Gerald looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Julian could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the weight of their expectations pressing down like a physical force. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice steady but loud enough to carry through the room. "Thank you for being here tonight. I know this event is about celebrating the charitable efforts of our family and our contributions to the community. But before we continue, there's something important that needs to be said." Gerald's smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched his son. Julian could see the tension building in his father's posture, the silent command to stop, to not take this any further. But Julian pressed on. "There's a truth that has been buried for far too long," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "My family built its empire on the destruction of another, a dynasty that was once powerful, a family that was torn apart by greed. My grandfather was responsible for the fall of this family, for taking everything they had, and leaving them with nothing." A ripple of shock went through the crowd, and Julian could hear the whispered questions, the disbelief. Gerald's expression darkened, his hands clenching at his sides. "This family's rightful heir is standing here with me tonight," Julian said, stepping aside to reveal Elena, who stood tall and proud despite the eyes now fixed on her. Elena's family was destroyed by the actions of my grandfather. And I can no longer stand by and pretend that this injustice never happened. The room fell into stunned silence. Julian could feel the tension, the disbelief. He knew that this was a bombshell that would shake his family's reputation to its core. But he didn't care. This was about more than reputation. It was about justice, about righting a wrong that had been ignored for far too long. Gerald took a step forward, his voice low and filled with barely controlled anger. "Julian, this is enough. You don't know what you're doing." Julian met his father's gaze, feeling a strange calm settle over him. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm choosing to stand with Elena, and to make things right. No matter what it costs me." Gerald's eyes blazed with fury. "You're throwing away everything, for what? For a fantasy? A story from a woman who lives in the dirt?" Julian didn't flinch. "For the truth. And for love?" The room was so silent that Julian could hear his own heartbeat. For a moment, he thought his father might strike him. The tension between them stretched so tightly it felt like it could snap at any second. But then Gerald straightened, his face a mask of cold fury. "You've made your choice, Julian," he said, his voice icy. "And now, you will face the consequences?" Julian nodded, the finality of his father's words sinking in. He had known this moment would come, that standing by Elena would mean losing everything he had ever known. But as he stood there, with Elena beside him, he knew he had made the right choice. Together, they turned and left the ballroom, the murmurs of disbelief and shock following them as they stepped into the night. The night air felt cool against Julian's skin as they stepped outside the ballroom, the city lights casting a soft glow over the streets. He and Elena walked in silence for a few moments, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Julian had known the consequences of his choice, but now, standing in the aftermath, the reality of it all began to sink in. "I'm sorry," Julian said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "For everything. For what my family did to yours, and for taking so long to do the right thing." Elena stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression soft but resolute. "You don't owe me an apology, Julian. You've done more than anyone else ever could. You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you everything." Julian sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "And now I've lost it all. My family, my fortune, everything I've ever known." Elena stepped closer, reaching for his hand. Her touch was warm, grounding him in the moment. "You haven't lost everything," she said softly. "You've gained something far more important. You've found yourself." Julian met her gaze, the tension in his chest easing slightly. She was right. For the first time in his life, he had chosen a path that felt true to who he really was, not the person his family expected him to be. The world of wealth and privilege he had grown up in felt distant now, like a part of a life he no longer belonged to. "What happens now?" Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena looked out at the city, her eyes reflecting the distant glow of the skyline. "Now, we move forward. Together?" Julian nodded, feeling the weight of that word, together. It was a simple word, but it held so much meaning now. He had chosen to stand by Elena, and in doing so, he had chosen a new life, one where the old rules no longer applied. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare him. "I don't need the money," Julian said, more to himself than to her. "I don't need the power, or the name. All of that can go. I'll make my own way, just like you did." Elena smiled, a small, hopeful smile that made Julian's heart lift. "We'll figure it out," she said. "And we'll do it on our terms?" They stood there for a moment, the city buzzing around them, their hands intertwined. Julian had sacrificed everything for this moment, for the chance to be free from the chains of his past. And though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. Together, they turned and walked into the night, leaving behind the glittering world of the ballroom and stepping into a new beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Julian had cut ties with his family, and true to his father's word, his inheritance was gone. The life of luxury and comfort he had known since birth had vanished, leaving him to face the reality of starting from nothing. But, despite everything, he didn't feel regret. If anything, he felt lighter. Julian and Elena returned to the landfill where their journey had begun. This place, once a symbol of loss and ruin, now felt like the foundation of something new. Together, they worked tirelessly, transforming the landfill into a space of renewal. With Julian's remaining connections and Elena's creativity, they began turning the forgotten remnants of society into art, into something beautiful. The idea took shape quickly. What was once a wasteland would now become a community center for those who had been left behind, a space for people to come together and rebuild. It wasn't easy. Julian faced countless challenges. The process of reclaiming the landfill was slow and arduous, and there were days when it felt like progress was impossible. The funds they had were limited, and without the safety net of his family's fortune, every decision carried weight. But through it all, Elena remained a constant source of strength. Elena's quiet resilience was what kept them going. She had spent years surviving in the landfill, and now, with Julian by her side, she was able to channel that strength into something greater. Together, they worked with the local community, bringing in volunteers, artists, and builders who believed in their vision. Slowly, the landfill began to change. Old materials were repurposed into sculptures, murals, and structures that breathed new life into the area. "What we're building here," Elena said one evening as they stood together, looking out over the progress they had made, "it's more than just a place. It's a chance for people to find hope again." Julian nodded, his heart swelling with pride. The transformation of the landfill mirrored the transformation in his own life. He no longer felt tied to the legacy of his family. Instead, he had found purpose in something real, something that mattered. "We're creating something that lasts," Julian said, his voice filled with conviction. "Something that isn't built on power or money. It's built on people." The landfill, once a place of despair, had become a symbol of rebirth. And as they continued to work side by side, Julian knew that this new life, this life with Elena, was worth far more than anything he had left behind. Together, they were building a future, one that reflected not just their dreams but the dreams of those who had been forgotten by the world. Months passed, and the landfill had transformed into something unrecognizable. What was once a forgotten wasteland was now a thriving center of community and creativity. Word spread quickly about what Julian and Elena were doing, and soon, people from all over the city came to see the transformation for themselves. The community center they had built became a place of refuge, not just for those seeking a second chance, but for anyone who wanted to be part of something meaningful. Julian and Elena walked through the center one evening, hand in hand, marveling at how much had changed. Children were playing in the newly built park, artists were painting murals on the walls of what had once been piles of trash, and volunteers were helping to organize the workshops and programs that now filled the space with life. The landfill had become a symbol of resilience and renewal, a testament to the power of hope and hard work. "I never imagined it would grow like this," Julian said, his voice filled with awe as he watched a group of kids laughing as they worked on a sculpture made from old metal scraps. "It's like the whole city is coming together." Elena smiled, her eyes soft as she looked at him. "You believed in this from the beginning, Julian. You made this possible?" Julian shook his head. "No, we made this possible. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Elena squeezed his hand, her smile growing wider. "Together," she said softly. It was a word they had come to use often, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had built together. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the center, Julian felt a deep sense of peace. He had left behind the life he had known, the wealth, the power, the expectations, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable. His relationship with Elena had deepened in ways he never imagined, built on trust, shared struggles, and a common purpose. They had created something that mattered, something that would last long after them. "I think we found it," Julian said, looking out at the vibrant community around them. "The future we were looking for." Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's just the beginning, Julian. There's so much more we can do." Julian smiled, feeling a sense of excitement stir within him. She was right. This was just the start. The world was filled with places like the landfill, places and people who had been discarded, left behind. But now, they had a blueprint, a way to bring hope and renewal to those places too. As they stood together, watching the final rays of the sun dip below the horizon, Julian knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And that, more than anything, gave him hope. Imagine losing everything you've ever known, your fortune, your family, even your identity, only to discover that true power lies in the hands of those you least expect. When a millionaire decides to leave his empire behind and follow a mysterious woman who lives among the outcasts, he is about to face a truth that could change his destiny forever. But the big question is, what would you do if you discovered that your past hides a secret that could overturn everything you believe in? Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery, where secrets buried in the trash can become life's greatest treasure. And, if you haven't subscribed yet, take advantage and do so now so you don't miss any of the next revelations of this exciting story.